Hi, my name is Michael Pritchard. If you're just tuning in, I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 Arts and Cultural Management Conference. I, alongside my colleagues Julia and Gabby, would like to also welcome you to our panel discussion entitled Navigating Access to the Arts During Times of Crisis, a case study of the 2008 Great Recession. In this panel discussion, we will go over a basic history of the Great Recession and arts funding structures in the United States, as well as the United States legislative response to the Great Recession. Then, based on a thorough review of literature surrounding this topic as it relates to the arts world, we will draw three key assumptions regarding how access to arts organizations was affected by the Great Recession, and conclude with a preliminary set of recommendations on how preventative measures could possibly be created to prevent the devastating impact of future economic disasters. To begin, I'd like to go over arts funding structure in the United States, in case you're not familiar with how the United States approaches funding arts organizations, as well as the local, state, and federal authorities that assist in distributing funds to artists and arts organizations. The United States federal response to a need for increased arts legislation came in 1965. Then President Lyndon Johnson created an act through the United States Congress which created a plethora of arts-related independent agencies. These agencies, including the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and others, were meant to provide a centralized federal backing to how arts organizations could receive grant funding and government-sponsored assistance in order to create their art and fulfill their missions and visions. Of course, one centralized federal response agency would not be enough to deal with all 50 U.S. states and the associated territories. Thus enters the state art agencies, or SAAs. Each of the 50 states, plus the 6 current United States territories, features a state arts agency. These agencies receive a portion of their funds from the National Endowment for the Arts, or the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as through state budget allocations made during the budgetary season for each state and territory they find themselves in. These state organizations feed directly down into the local counties, municipalities, cities, and towns in the form of local arts agencies. While not every county or city has a local arts agencies, those that do find key relationships between their agencies and the arts organizations that serve them. Many legacy arts organizations often rely on funding appropriated from the local arts agencies in order to meet payroll or to keep their buildings open. This relationship is key and pivotal, and you can see how this top-down funding model works, in theory, from the federal agency all the way down to the local arts organizations, passing through the state and local levels along the way. In this slide, you can see nominal and inflation-adjusted dollars representing federal, state, and local government arts funding. In red at the top, we see the estimated total direct expenditures on arts organizations by local governments, ranging from approximately $600 million to $800 million plus dollars a year in recent years. Beneath, in blue, we see the total legislative appropriations to state arts agencies, ranging from $400 million down to $200 million, and currently averaging in 2018 at approximately $325 million. In green, at the bottom, we see the total federal appropriation to the National Endowment for the Arts, hovering roughly around $100 million per year for the past 18 years. Now, this model seems to work in reverse from the arts funding structure we initially went over. That's because the arts funding structure I discussed does not include local donations, private donations, grants from for-profit companies in the area or in the state, as well as any sort of endowment fund set up to donate directly to local arts agencies or state arts agencies. The appropriations made by local and state governments often are far more than the appropriations made by the federal government to the National Endowment for the Arts. We will see these discrepancies play a key factor in our discussion as to certain issues that could have been foreseen in the economic impacts of the Great Recession. The Great Recession was the sharp decline of economic activity during the late 2000s and early 2010s. Many scholars and prominent economists have since determined it to be the most significant downturn since the Great Depression in the 1930s. It featured a gross domestic product decline of more than 10%, and an unemployment rate that at one point reached 25% in the United States. This downturn began when the United States housing market bubble went from boom to bust, and large amounts of mortgage-backed securities and associated derivatives lost significant value. As the impacts from the United States fallout were felt globally, specifically in countries which had close associations with the United States housing market, such as many parts of Western Europe and parts of Oceania, it's important to note that certain countries, such as China, Indonesia, and Taiwan, were spared from many of the negative effects which surrounded the Great Recession. We too can see the negative effects of the Great Recession in the arts world as a whole. Arts and cultural employment from 2006 to 2016 suffered from a significant U-shaped decline, bottoming out from 2010 to 2012. We see in this chart that the United States went from approximately 5,200,000 arts jobs in 2006 all the way down to just below 4,700,000 arts jobs from 2010 to 2012. We see in recent years that while these numbers have improved, this significant downturn resulted in hundreds, if not thousands, of closures for arts organizations across the United States. Many organizations simply could not recover from this significant impact and loss of employment. In response to the Great Recession, newly elected President Barack Obama signed into law the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009. One of President Obama's first major victories as president allowed for this act to allocate $50 million to the National Endowment for the Arts in an effort to both preserve jobs and fund arts projects in response to this tragedy. The bill made provisions for 40% of this amount to be distributed to state arts agencies and regional arts organizations in the same manner that the NEA already distributed funds, while giving the remaining 60% to competitively selected arts projects and activities, in the form of grant money paid without a matching requirement. By analyzing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 and its impact on these key elements of cultural practices, both positive and negative, we begin to see clearly the effects this law had on United States performing arts organizations and national cultural policy. As the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act approached its signing, many worried that the $50 million allotted for the arts would not be enough to prevent job layoffs, artist payments, or even keep organizations open. Many arts organizations openly expressed the possibility for the furloughing or reduction to part-time for many, if not all, staff positions. As previously discussed, we can begin to see clearly certain impacts felt by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act onto cultural practices and policy within the United States. Reviewing the literature allows us to draw three key assumptions relating to how the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act impacted arts organizations and arts funding structures throughout the United States. These include looking at audience motivation for attending the arts, the potential ineffectiveness of state arts agencies, as well as national cultural values surrounding how arts and culture is viewed within the United States. By combining these assumptions, we can begin to see how access to the arts may be incredibly affected by how arts organizations prepare and deal with times of crisis. In the following section, my colleagues Julia and Gabby are going to take you through these assumptions and expand on how exactly they affect the United States cultural policy, local, state, and federal arts organizations, and the crisis response of these arts organizations during the Great Recession.
When looking at the impact that the 2008 Great Recession and the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act has had on the arts and cultural sector in the United States, we've made three assumptions. The first assumption is that no amount of stimulus bailout can impact the intrinsic factors of motivation that lead to audience attendance or participation with arts and cultural organizations. And when we look at audience motivation, arts advocacy frequently relies on the quantifiable extrinsic values that the arts can provide. Some of those extrinsic values are economic impact. When looking at arts education, we're looking at improved test scores, things like that are really the extrinsic values that the arts can provide for us. But it's really hard to describe, and it is very overtly qualitative to talk about the intrinsic factors of and value that the arts provide. And that is a key part of audience motivation that is not utilized as well as it could be. When you're looking at what those intrinsic factors are, arts and cultural organizations should seek to create a shared sense of urgency. And this shared sense of urgency is when the arts and cultural organization and the community see the need for one another. Both entities want to work together to achieve a goal. It is clear that prior to the 2008 recession, arts and cultural organizations in the United States were not prioritizing this. And so a lot of organizations closed because there was not a sense of urgency on the community's end to make sure that those organizations continued. And so it is interesting also to look at during the economic downturn of 2008, when a lot of organizations did close, if they had learned or improved strategies to work with their community and build those community connections, which are important factors of motivation so that they can grow their audience and continue to stay open, what lessons were learned in 2008 that can be applied to the current economic situation caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so when we're looking at audience motivation, we also want to look at barriers to access, because even if we have community members who want to attend an arts and cultural event, there may be barriers to access that are preventing them from doing so. And so the first one, currently, which I will briefly mention because I know we all have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, it has created significant barriers to access for arts and cultural organizations, because it's inhibiting how we perform in physical spaces in group gatherings. Those are just not possible right now. And seeing how organizations are responding to this, because it is a different barrier than a traditional economic downturn such as the one in 2008 can cause. And so something we've seen now is that a lot of arts and cultural organizations have turned to providing online content and online programming, which can be seen as more accessible when people don't have to travel to an event. They can watch it in their own home. But UNESCO estimates that almost 1 in 2 people globally cannot access online programming because of their lack of internet connectivity. And so while providing online content may make some programming more accessible, it can also be a barrier to access to those around the globe who do not have internet access. And then looking at the arts education and the impact that an economic downturn can have on arts education in the public schools specifically. Ingenuity, which is an organization that studies the Chicago public schools, found that in 2018 to 2019, 35% of students did not have consistent access to arts education. And the 35% of students are predominantly Black, and it shows a great inequity in the arts education opportunities for students in the United States. And this was pre-COVID-19. In the same study, they found that arts educators' support from their schools had been cut by 10%. The number of elementary students that were receiving consistent art education had also dropped. And so these were mostly due to budget cuts. And so again, this study was conducted 2018 to 2019. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'm sure has further impacted the ability of students in the public schools to have arts education. And so we want to continue to look at how can organizations learn from the mistakes made in 2008, what was done between 2008 to 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic, and what can we learn about connecting with our community to build our audience and removing barriers to access as best that we can, and what are the lessons that can be learned there.
Assumption 2 deals with the ineffectiveness of the SAAs, or state arts agencies, here in the United States. State arts agencies were and continue to be ineffective in creating long-term financial plan for their constituents, or in this case, performing arts organizations. Current literature tends to suggest that state arts agencies have likely outgrown their usefulness to arts organizations, specifically performing arts organizations, mostly from a financial standpoint. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that SAAs are incapable of overseeing a statewide effort of funding distribution to local arts organizations because they are not adequately guided by the state legislature. And every state legislature operates a little bit differently here in the United States. And so every state is a little bit different, and therefore every state arts agency is a little bit different. But because of that, there isn't this overarching expectation of what to do with the funds and how state arts agencies are supposed to manage these funds and be able to effectively support these performing arts organizations that they oversee. Other literature also suggests that state arts agencies actually shouldn't possess or oversee the distribution of these funds, and it's because they tend to fail to plan for any type of succession or collapse of these organizations. Take the COVID-19 crisis, for example, where a lot of performing arts organizations here in the United States are barely making ends meet at the moment. So there's also that side of the argument as well. Now, there is also the argument with the National Endowment for the Arts, or the NEA. And the NEA actually also fails to outline how state arts agencies are to distribute funds awarded to these performing arts organizations if it's outside of the NEA's parameters. So if the NEA doesn't oversee it, it doesn't give state arts agencies any type of guideline on how to adequately fund and oversee those funds for these performing arts organizations. One scholar also talked on this and said that they believe that public support for the arts can only happen through a more effective collaboration between the NEA and SAAs. This was by Love back in 1991. And so this collaboration is still not really happening here in the United States. It's happening maybe a little bit more, but not as much as we would hope. And so there's two sides of this. One, the NEA needs information provided by state arts agencies about their own needs so that the NEA can properly support state arts agencies. And the other side of this is that state arts agencies also need the NEA's assistance in persuading state legislature the importance of proper arts funding. And so that lies another issue too, that maybe state arts agencies don't have the support they need to be able to get the support from their state legislature to support the performing arts organizations. But it is important to reiterate that every state is different here in the United States. And so this ineffectiveness could come through a little bit differently because every state legislature and every state arts agency operates differently. And so the needs of every state arts agency might be a little bit different because of each state's needs.
Our third assumption is that the impacts of the Americans Recovery and Reinvestment Act serves as an indicator that arts and cultural organizations must retool and reprioritize their cultural values and their primary methods of revenue generation. If organizations hope to stay open during times of economic downturn, it is important that they realign their cultural practices to better serve their audience and to better serve their community, so that in these times their community supports them and allows them to stay open. In addition to the role of these individual organizations, the current funding model in the United States is not effective, it is not sustainable, and it is not equitable. And so looking at the actual Americans Recovery and Reinvestment Act, there is only one paragraph describing how the funds were to be spent on arts and cultural organizations. So the amount of funding that went to the NEA, and then there was no oversight on how states' arts agencies were to distribute the funds outside of their typical parameters. And so this led to and perpetuated the current inequitable funding model that exists in the United States. And so while it would take a lot of work to implement a new funding model would allow arts organizations to build contingency plans and create accounts in case of future fallout so that they aren't faced with the possibility of closing. And while the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act did successfully keep some arts organizations open, if these organizations hope to continue during future times of economic downturn. It's important that there's large-scale policy changes. That way, future closures can be avoided during economic disasters.
In analyzing these three assumptions and thinking back to how they affected cultural policy and the response arts organizations had to the Great Recession, it is I and my colleagues' belief that these three assumptions, when looked at conjointly and intersectionally, accurately represent the many issues with access to the arts during times of crisis in the United States. The Great Recession provides an excellent case study to look at to determine the many reasons that so many arts organizations were forced to close during this time of crisis, how many career artists lost their jobs and had to move to other fields, and the potentiality for future economic crises, such as COVID-19, to bear similar negative impacts across the nation if we do not begin to look at how we can restructure and rebrand our entire way of thinking about funding arts in the United States. So where does this lead us? We believe that a preliminary set of recommendations could be taken up by various arts advocates and legislative advocates in order to promote a new and innovative method of thinking about how arts organizations in the United States can be funded. First, we propose that immediately a cabinet-level and Senate-confirmed Secretary of Arts and Culture must be appointed by the President of the United States. This cabinet secretary, associated cabinet, and employees and departments within this cabinet reflects to the public the importance that the government is placing in the arts and cultural development of the United States. Without such importance placed upon the weight of arts and culture for the sake of being arts and culture, and thinking back to those motivations for attendance discussed by Gabby, it's hard to create that sort of national buy-in as to the importance of allocating money each budgetary season for arts in the United States. Once a cabinet position is created and Senate confirmed, and we have a new Secretary of Arts and Culture and a Cabinet of Arts and Culture, that cabinet must immediately begin work to develop a national cultural policy which meets the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 SDGs provide an excellent framework as to how the United States and our cultural policy can be created in a sustainable manner which provides not only for today, but for future generations as well. When we think forward about how our children and our children's children will appreciate arts and culture in the United States, and the archive work and preservation that goes into creating a cultural policy and a direction for how the arts will be handled, it's important that this be created in a method that is both global, sustainable, and research approved. Finally, with these goals and policies set in place by the Cabinet and the Secretary of Arts and Culture, this national policy must be developed to work with all 56 state arts agencies in order to create consistent funding and programs which work to ensure equitable access to the arts for all patrons, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, location, ability, or any other demographics which may statistically prevent individuals from accessing the arts in their local communities. By doing this, we allow state arts agencies to relieve so much of the burden and uncertainty that comes from their annual funding structures. This national cultural policy, with the buy-in from consumers and patrons of the arts around the United States, will allow for state arts agencies to understand that they are valued, they are important, and that they will receive normalized amounts to funding in every single budget year. This will allow organizations for the state and local level to begin developing long-term economic practices, goals, benchmarks, and strategic plans for their organizations, patrons, and artists. While these recommendations certainly are not easy, it mirrors many of the cabinets and ministries of cultural affairs that you may have in your country. My colleagues and I believe quite strongly that this is the first step toward preventing another economic catastrophe, whether medical, financial, housing, or otherwise, from negatively impacting so many arts organizations, artists, arts audiences, and arts associates in the United States. Creation of a national cabinet level with firm developed cultural policy which aligns with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and development of consistent funding and programs with all state arts agencies will allow equitable access to the arts to become a top priority for a nation moving into the 21st century. To close, we would like to reference a quote by our nation's first president, George Washington. "The arts and sciences, essential to the prosperity of the state and to the ornament of human life, have a primary claim to the encouragement of every lover of his country and of mankind. This prosperity of the state must be reflected by the state itself in order to ensure arts organizations' success now and in the future. Thank you so much for coming to our panel presentation today, and enjoy the rest of the 2021 Arts and Cultural Management Conference.